This episode is a segment from our book review on Desiring God. In this segment, we question why the church isn't more joyful. Was Jesus always somber and serious like he's often portrayed? And perhaps most importantly, are dirty jokes sinful? So make sure you finish and enjoy.
That's what she said.
You're listening to Campfire Theology, where we explore topics you usually wouldn't discuss in church. So gather around with us because we believe the conversation itself is holy.
So even as a kid, like for anybody that knows the Enneagram, I'm a 7 on the Enneagram. So basically I just like joy and like things to a fault. And so
like obsession.
Yeah, like I
just like to try new things constantly.
I like to try new things constantly, and I like to always do something, and sitting still and doing nothing is
Difficult.
very difficult and the opposite of what I want to do.
Gotcha.
And I see that now in my daughter. I think she's a 7 too. Like my oldest, she just wants to constantly do something. It doesn't even matter what it is. If you're doing something, it's something new, and it's therefore exciting, therefore we have fun. So all that to say, a lot of times I really struggled in the church because it felt very anti-joy.
I agree with that.
Like it's you have to follow these things.
Felt more like a duty to me growing up.
Yeah, that for sure. And there was a lack of freedom to enjoy what God has given you. It was like, obviously turning from sin is important, but I hated when I would walk away from church a lot of the times and just feeling terrible about myself. And I know I'm not alone in that, because I know a lot of people have turned simply for that reason. And there's value in that, but I always felt like the go-to in a sermon is, hey, what are you doing wrong? Let's point that out and show.
Yeah, or what can you do better?
Yeah. And we gotta get on top of that, and you have to be better than that.
Yeah.
And so
guilt-based.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And so that would often turn me off from wanting to go. Not that it's stopped me per se, but I just always felt like this idea of, man, if God created us and created this world, created everything in it, he also created joy, he created happiness, and there's just this like dark cloud of that God is this anti-joy monster who wants you just to obey what he says. And that just always seemed antithetical to how I was, like my actual nature. And I was struggling with that. So this, to me, the book resonated for me in that regard of, no, God made you to enjoy and to take pleasure and delight in his goodness. It actually like requires it of you.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
yeah.
I thought it was, I always had kind of almost like the opposite growing up, where I always thought like I agree with you that, okay, first happiness and joy, I always think of two pretty different things,
separate things,
right?
yeah.
Like happiness is kind of a fleeting emotion, right? Oh, I got a new car, I'm so happy. And then like a month later, you're like, oh, I didn't realize I had to pay this payment it's not true, like happiness, right?
Not long lasting.
Yeah, and it's not like this internal indwelling joy, right? Where if you meet somebody who's like confident in their faith and they know God, and they're just sometimes they just have like a joy about them that's like almost indescribable.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, their day's going terrible and they haven't got a new car in 5 years, but they're just like
So dang happy.
it's not even happy like they're like, oh, I'm so happy. They're just like so content with
Yeah,
life.
I agree with you, but I'm not sure the majority of people are able to differentiate between that. Because
I agree.
I think as a kid, I would associated the same two things.
The same two things. Same. I agree.
Synonyms,
And not
basically.
until like I was an adult did
I think a lot of
bad.
I think a lot of adults still think of it as the
agree.
same. And I think they search for that happy feeling, and they don't always get it at church. So they do, they do drugs, or they, or drink a lot, or they go to parties or the club or whatever, and that gives out that happy feeling. and yet they still feel empty at the end of the day.
Are you talking about like people chasing basically a dopamine effect, or
That's kind of what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
Yep. When I think of happiness, that's more what I think. Like that fleeting emotion, that chemical release in your body where you're just like, wow, that was awesome. But it doesn't really last. You know, you make all this money, you get a big bonus, and you're like, oh, you know, just a few days later, a few hours later, you're like, oh, this didn't actually make me happy.
Right.
But when you think about something like having a wife who loves you and like, you know, children who want to be around you, and you're like so proud of what they're doing, and you see how they are.
Yeah.
You're like, that brings you like a true indwelling joy. And I feel like a lot of that is rooted. For me, I always felt very like maybe more joyous than I did happy. Like when I would go to church and stuff, I never really used to feel like happy about it. It was always more of like a duty.
Right.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, I felt like I had this peace, this calm, this joy.
Right.
In the fact that like I knew God, I knew my destiny in the afterlife, and I had like a real peace about that, and that gave me a different joyous outlook on life.
Absolutely.
Although church itself and hanging out with kids from church stuff rarely made me feel happy.
Sure.
So as a kid, I wanted to be happy, right? And I didn't really appreciate the fact that my parents were trying to really give me more of a foundation,
right,
for really more of a joyous life, where there's true joy, like in Christ,
right,
for me. And I think, but there's different. You know, not everybody realizes that those two are different.
Yeah,
and not everyone has the same experience.
I don't know if you guys ever went to, I think Kyle, you did, and I'm not sure if Joey, you might have also been to Christian camp when you were a kid.
Yep. Yeah.
And especially like middle school, high school, that's where like I started taking my faith very seriously, was in, it was elementary school, but then when we got to middle school and high school, it was like a week long of everybody's nice to each other. Like there's so much devotional time. There's a ton of praise and worship time. Like everybody's getting into it. Everybody is honestly really trying hard. Much more so than like you would have at maybe a normal church service. You come back to your normal church service and you're like, oh, these people aren't really trying that hard. It seems like, but you have that joy, and it's like, I've heard pastors talk about it as like a mountaintop experience. So like you're up at the mountaintop, but you know, inevitably you're going to be coming down again. So, you know, is that league really just full of those chemical reactions, and am I really just chasing that feeling? Or am I doing what Piper is asking us to do in this book here, is really chase after God, specifically enjoying him and separating that from the blessings of him? I think that was a big part of this book, is separating who God is and his character and just enjoying him for who he is, separate from, you know, oh, he's blessed me with an amazing family. He's blessed me with a job. He's blessed me with fellowship with friends. Like all those things are great, but I think Piper has a higher calling in mind when he talks about enjoying God forever, different than enjoying the blessings of him forever, if that makes sense.
I think,
it makes sense.
That's, I would go to camp for a week every summer, and that was one of the best weeks every year for me. And I would walk away from it with that same feeling of like, oh, this feels more like Christianity to me.
Exactly.
This feels more like what the Christian faith should be, instead of going to church for an hour, walking away feeling guilty or feeling bad about myself.
Right.
And then that's it.
Yep. And another week passes, and
then you come back and do it again. So I think when I originally asked you guys to go to camp, I think I was longing for that feeling again as an adult, because there's always been this disconnect to me, where a lot of times like kids church is so fun, right? You have vacation Bible camp, and then you go to church camp, and then your services are fun half the time, and then you go on a retreat and you get to play sports and play all these games, and you learn about God. And it's like when you become an adult, it's, hey, you got to show up for an hour service on the Sunday morning, and there's not a lot of fun to be had. It's time to get serious. And it's like, is it though? Is that right?
Can we still have fun?
Yeah. So like that searching for me was the idea of the camp was what I was always longing for. Like, and that's why it's like one of the best weekends.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Me
every
too.
year that we go.
I always feel like those Christian church camps, and we have been to those, had similar experiences, right?
Yes.
Like I said, everyone's on their like best behavior.
It's true.
And also,
Everybody's trying to be a
not only
Christian,
that,
too.
Yeah,
but
yeah,
the
yeah,
and the Holy Spirit is present in those moments.
I would
like
agree.
big time, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like it's almost like a little glimpse of what God had in mind
Yeah.
for a greater church, right?
Yeah.
Or for like, hey,
Or heaven
this is like a
experience.
quick preview of what heaven could be like,
Yeah.
but every day.
Right.
And I find it interesting that we basically all had those experiences as kids,
I know.
and we agree. I also went to football camp for a week.
Me too.
I also went to basketball camp for a week or whatever, and that was fun. But it's not the same.
For
It's
sure.
not the same. And there's happy moments and there's fun moments and stuff,
Mhm.
but it's not the same as going to like a Christian camp where you're worshiping with your friend.
So
That helped. Yeah, that was
Yeah.
very hard.
You always think.
That's why I would go to the Christian camp so I could really dominate the homeschool kids.
Hey,
Sorry, Joey. Shout out to Joey.
but no, I think, like you said, like I think we all had those experiences, you know, and I spent 7 summers up at camp working up there and stuff like that.
Right.
was it that long? So
It was
7
yeah.
summers,
If you actually take it out and like how long I spent up at camp, it's over 3 years of my life. I mean,
that's
But you were also a camper too, though, right? Before you did staff.
yeah, yep, I
Okay.
was. But like even when you, that's one thing we always talk about when we were up there is like when you're up at camp, you're constantly serving with people who have the same mission, who have the same goal. We're
Right.
all up there like-minded. Everybody's focusing on the mission of spreading the gospel, and it's almost like this bubble.
Yeah,
like
for sure.
you're there by yourself, basically. Like you were saying, you feel the presence of the Holy Spirit. You feel that
Absolutely.
you are 100% surrounded. You're 100% in the right place,
Mhm.
and then you leave, and you're no longer a part of that bubble at the end of the summer.
Right.
And not only that, but everybody that you're surrounded with when you get back, not a single one of those people had the same experience that you
Right.
had during the summer. And it's so easy for them to just like basically just piece you apart.
drag
Because it's like-
you down into the mud.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like you had a great summer, huh? And you try telling them like, the heck are you talking about? Like especially if you went like back to school or something like that, they're like, you start telling like, I'm like, yeah, you know, I got to share the gospel. Like it's the gospel. What are you talking about? And stuff like
Exactly.
that. And it's so difficult to stay in that mountaintop mindset
Exactly.
when the first thing you see is someone trying to drag you down just because they didn't experience the same thing that you did, and get them to feel
Yeah.
that. You know what
Do
I
you
mean?
guys think that the mountaintop is a bad thing? I always get kind of frustrated there where it's like, oh yeah, you're on a mountaintop, but you'll come crashing back down. Don't worry, that's not the real world. And it's like, yeah, okay, but at the same time, I think there's a ton of value in the recharge factor. Like,
Yep.
why do you go on vacation? You need to recharge because you can't work for 25 years straight without missing a day. It's kind of the point is to get away, quote unquote, recharge your batteries. And that's kind of your mountaintop in a non-Christian way.
Absolutely.
Say, right? So
Yeah.
like,
Yep.
I think it's also like a good leader trying to prepare you for reality because they know
Clear.
and they've experienced the fact that, hey, this bubble does end at the end of the week or at the end of the summer.
Yep.
And you are going to be back in the real world. And like what you have at camp, what you experience at camp, it isn't anything magical about that property or about it's people, right? And it's
Exactly.
people who get like-minded, who are like-minded and who bring others into that.
Right.
And what they're trying to say is like, it's not like this everywhere.
Right.
Be prepared, but also be prepared like to go on offense a little bit. Like you can create the same environment at your school
Exactly.
or at your church or at
Yes,
your
the
youth group,
missions.
right?
Yeah.
Like not to convict you, not to make you feel guilty that you haven't, but just to say, hey, this isn't going to last forever. And when those hard times come, you would be wise to be prepared mentally because it could be very depressing, like you said, if you get back to the quote unquote real world and it's nowhere near the mountaintop that you've been enjoying for a week or for a month at camp.
For sure. For me specifically, I remember coming back from camp every year and then having so much more temptation, like the day I came back from camp, to give in to whatever sins I was struggling with, whether it was anger or lust or, even cursing or things like that.
It's interesting.
Like, as soon as I got back, it was like, I don't know, the enemy was ready to pounce, I think. And sort of like, if you have an experience, even like maybe not at camp, but even somewhere else where you're having an experience, like for us together at a men's retreat or us together at a men's night or something, and we're feeling close to God, then there is almost a vulnerability to us that it could be easy to snatch it away. I don't know if that makes sense. It could be easy for the enemy to come in and kind of grab you. Or one little thing goes wrong and it sort of tumbles you. That's how I know I get in the struggle of like that sort of guilty cycle is like, well, the thing I did wrong negated all the good things I did that previous week.
Yeah.
That's
That's just the enemy.
absolutely it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it is the preparation that you need, like you were saying, Will, to
Preparation.
yes. Sometimes you need that too. If you
Depends on the camp food.
yeah. Different orifices are red and swollen. Yeah, so I think to your point, Kyle, just about the mountaintop experience and enjoying God, I think we really don't focus on that in church. I think we try to with maybe like the worship session that we have.
Sure.
And he talked about it in the book. He called it the feast of a Christian hedonist, that when you're worshiping God, like the singing part of it or other ways that you worship God. I don't know. Do we really think of that as like a feast experience? Like, are we
I was just going to comment on worship, how we talked about like there's two different things. Like you have this really joyous experience like at summer camp or it's at church sometimes. I think
Sure.
at Easter Sunday at Hopeville,
like a great example.
like that was pure joy. And I really feel like the worship can really set the tone between like a guilt-based message and a joyous message.
Absolutely.
Like Easter Sunday, it's just like boom, bright lights, super loud music, upbeat, 25 people on the stage, choir, everybody's singing, smiling, clapping, and you're just like, man, this just feels like you get that dopamine dump, and you're like, man, this is it. This is like, man, this is summer camp for adults, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And then there's other times where you are led into worship that is maybe much more like sorrowful or reflective and slow and kind of almost sets the tone for like, hey, what have you been doing wrong in your life? And
Right.
I think there's a time for both of those messages.
Yeah.
But I do think it's we don't always get the joy one maybe as much as I would like to. Do you remember our old worship leader used to always rip the banjo like once a month?
Yeah. Yeah, I do actually. Yeah.
Because it was just on those days you could just tell everyone was laughing, and he's like, "Yeah, I can't believe we're playing the banjo in church," and there was just like this palpable like
Right, yeah,
excitement
just a
around
fun
it, right?
kind of thing. Yeah.
And I always thought that was really set the mood for like a good worship, not only worship experience, but like receiving a message with a joyous heart.
Yeah.
I think that's so much of the non-denominational movement is rooted in that, like
The fun aspect or
the worship aspect,
The worship aspect.
the worship music. Like at our church, we have so many former Catholics and Lutherans and Baptists, and what I've heard so many times is that the biggest difference is the worship music.
Sure.
Right. Like my grandma's a Catholic, and she'll come for like Christmas or something like that, and she just loves the worship music instead of pulling out the hymn book and listening to the Catholic priest sing the same hymns over and over. And there's a lack of engagement, I think, in that respect. Now, not for everybody, right? Some people enjoy that repetition.
Sure.
But I think in general, we've seen that. I think you can look over the last 25, 30 years in Christianity and point to that as one of the major catalysts for non-denominational.
Sure.
And even like, a lot of faiths now have the, what do they call it? Like the new worship or the hymnal, however they want to phrase it, right? So they have two different services. In two
Right.
different
Yeah.
bands.
Traditional
So
and modern or
same
something
thing,
like that. Yeah.
modern, where it's like, which one do you want to go to? Or what if you're like modern and you're like, oh, we missed the modern one. Now we got to go. We got to go traditional or vice versa.
Yeah. That
Right?
would
We got
be,
and stuff.
That would be
It's
rough.
different. It's interesting.
it's almost intentionally splitting the church.
It is.
Yeah.
But
So
I don't know.
usually same sermon with different songs.
Different words.
They do that at my brother's church. They have like the one that's early, like in the morning is like 9, and they do all hymns.
were geared toward
Oh, that's
older
interesting.
Yeah,
folks.
and it's like an organ or a keyboard,
Yeah, right.
and that's it. You know what I mean, kinds of thing.
Yeah.
And then they do
12 o'clock, they rock out.
Yeah, they have like
Red Bull's in the lobby, kids.
they do the guitars and all the things. You know, as exciting as church can get, I guess. I think there's a
Red Bulls in
sense
the lob. That's communion. Communion is Red Bull.
Communion's a Red Bull.
that would be pretty good. I think there's
Do
a-
this and remember to me. Do the do.
It'll
do
give you wings.
this Mountain Dew this.
But it's code red. You know?
Oh
Yeah,
yeah,
oh,
that's
nice,
right. Yeah, so
nice.
it's like
That makes
it
sense.
looks like
Actually,
blood and it's
look at
bubbly
the
like drug.
extract from the moral list. I actually saw somebody on Instagram that just found a way to make wine out of Mountain Dew, so you can just make that.
That's weird.
No way, for
Yeah,
real.
yeah. I don't think it was.
They can ferment it.
Yeah, you like ferment it, or you turn it into a mead.
Oh man.
Yeah. So you can reach out if that's what you want for your next communion.
Side note.
Yeah, I know. Just made me think of it.
Interesting.
Just
Yeah.
fact.
Ferment them up.
I think there's a sense of like if church is fun, then you're not doing it right.
Yeah, I agree with
Totally.
Or like that, yeah, you know, if you don't take your faith seriously and are very somber, then like you're not a very disciplined person, kind of.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Like you must just be like
And
an
discipline
Easter- yeah.
equals better Christian,
exactly.
right? Like,
Yep.
Which is like the exact opposite of what this book says. Like his,
yeah,
exactly.
exactly.
his
Yeah.
entire thing is
Yeah.
like, he's like, hey, I want to find happiness in God, and I think it's okay for me to look for happiness in God.
Yeah.
Exactly.
You know.
Yep.
And so like that's what I appreciate about the book is like I think the what is the is a cataclysm? It's a Heidelberg cataclysm or whatever. Am I saying that right? That's that thing where he says that the chief end of man is to
Oh, yeah.
The Westminster Shorter Catechism
that's what I'm looking for. So what does it say? Do you have a
says the chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever.
yeah? And he changes it
Mm-hmm.
to be the chief end of man is to glorify God by enjoying Him forever.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Which is like, yeah, basically he's saying, you know, like, I want to glorify God by finding my enjoyment and my happiness in this life in Him or through God.
Yeah.
Yeah, because there's always such a negative. It's not even negative. It's just like a removal of. Okay, so if you want to really take your faith seriously, you need to not drink, don't stay out late,
Mhm.
don't do all these things that are like the world says is fun. So you're like, oh,
Right.
so you kind of just have this like almost like an obligation. Like, well, I really want to be a serious Christian, but I don't always want to be serious. Like, I
Right.
want to just be goofy and like enjoy Christ and make jokes and like
Yeah.
Yeah.
and have people around who are like we're laughing, smiling, doing the summer camp thing, but in real life all
Yeah.
day long. And that's
Yes.
really hard to find though. I mean,
It is.
that is like a rarity. And it's weird is because I find it really ironic because so many people desire that
Mhm.
and don't know how to articulate that
Sure.
and actually like execute it in real life. So they just kind of go through the motions. Like you said, they go to church. They don't want to be someone like laughing and joking during communion. So they're just everybody somber and serious, and then everyone leaves, and you
You're
kind of
like,
miss
okay,
out on like
now
all
we-
the fun
now we
part.
can have fun.
Yeah.
I had a lot of people that are
It
that
almost
way,
goes
right?
back to
Yeah.
like the Gentiles versus the Jews, like in like the start of the start of like the church and
Mhm.
beginning of Acts, where it's like basically saying like
I mean,
the
Acts
Jews
was-
are completely like they're following the old traditions, they're following the old law, where it's all about discipline, it's all about following every
Right,
single
right.
regulation and stuff like that. And when Paul steps in, he's like, "No, we found Jesus. We want to be happy with Jesus. Like
Right.
he came here to essentially like free you from those requirements, so you
Right.
can find Him and find your enjoyment in life in Him."
So that reminds me of the show The Chosen. I know I've repped this a few times. Great show if anyone's listening.
Great show.
We'd love for them to sponsor us. If
Yeah.
They could.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're actually looking for sponsors. So they can
Actually,
make
other way
season
around.
5. Yeah.
Mutual agreement. If they plug us, we plug them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But they do a really good job in that of portraying like the human side of Jesus.
Mhm.
And they show him laughing and joking, and some of like his actual red letter quotes that we read in a real serious tone.
Mhm.
They say, no, here's exactly what he said, but it's not a serious tone. He said it in a joking tone, tongue in cheek. He was teasing the disciples in this. And you're like, oh man. it's a different take, and we don't know exactly how he said it, right?
Sure. Yeah,
But
makes you think.
it really portrays him in a very very human way, and you're like, man, I would want to just hang around this guy, and like,
Yeah.
it wouldn't all be all seriousness and crucifixion and pain, like
Right.
as we sometimes is portrayed. It was like, man, this guy was hilarious. Like, he was fun and funny, and he would
Turn
poke,
the other cheek.
he would
and he's
poke
like,
jabs at you.
He turns his butt cheek. Is that what? You
That's
mean?
exactly
He's like,
what.
turn it down. He's like,
I think that was
Yeah,
season
get-
5. I think that was season 5.
That was an outtake. I think.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was the deluxe edition.
super chosen.
I actually had to pay for that one.
Right.
Yeah, deleted scenes.
So, but with the guilt base, when like when I was like in college, that's what turned me on to like Rob Bell's preaching,
Right.
because I felt like for the first time that I heard a pastor focus more on the positives of God and of faith in Christianity.
And making up his own theology.
Well,
right on the
eventually it
spot.
went that way, right? Like,
Yeah,
but originally he was very rooted and brought so much of the Hebrew and everything. That's the first
Yeah,
time I ever
He was
heard that
very evangelical
incorporated.
too, but like
He
the
was.
new school evangelical. Where
Yeah.
John Piper, I think, to me, is the old school evangelical.
Sure, but
It's
like
quite a bit of
but it was like I didn't walk away from his sermons feeling terrible about myself. It was like, oh yeah, like
people.
God already has this all mapped out. I'm already saved. Let's enjoy life. And now you can go down his theology now where it's turned into
Or
an
universalistic.
entire separate conversation, right?
Sure.
But it was like and I saw that in the people that were there in church with him, and it was like, whoa, this is just a different experience, and people could feel it, and that's why
Yeah.
he blew up in a hurry.
Right.
And that's part of where so many pastors had such an issue with him at the time, was like, oh, your congregants went out and had a beer and stuff like that, like, are you even a Christian? You know, and it's like, come on, like, get over yourself a little bit. Times I always feel like that.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
get off your high horse.
Joey
you know what I mean? Like,
Joey makes an interesting point. Like, it's almost like the Christian faith is rooted in a lot of ways in the Old Testament ideal of self-control and discipline and rule
Absolutely.
following. And it's like, that is probably much more synonymous with being a Christian than it probably should be or has to be. Yep.
Mhm.
Do you think that's like an era? What's the word for, like, the age? Generational. Thank you. Like, because when we were growing up, the generation above us that are going to be 40, 50 years old, they're far more like work at GM and a little bit more rule based, as opposed to, I feel like our generation is far less rule based.
I think every generation says that.
Yeah,
Is
I
that
wonder
true?
about that because like the '60s were like the hippie movement too. You know
Right.
what I mean? So
But
like,
that was also like a section that was anti
it was a
what everybody else
subculture
was,
kind of
right?
thing. Yeah.
And that's why it became so popular, I think,
Yeah.
because that's the
But-
same reason.
But I think in
yeah.
general, every generation gets less conservative.
Sure, like
I would agree.
flies from
Yeah.
authority,
And I don't mean politically conservative. I just mean,
like
in general.
traditionalist.
yes.
Yeah. They don't value the old ways as much as they did,
All right.
which is interesting because the Bible really does talk, like Jeremiah specifically talks about valuing the old ways and stick to the ancient paths and that kind of thing. And but I think we sometimes have the idea that if that's not like fun or romantic, or that's not adventurous for me to just do what I did before. But maybe God is trying to, I think part of this book for me was trying to instill joy and happiness in like reading your scriptures together, or instill that happiness in singing praise and worship, or instill that happiness in listening and having a conversation. So like, for example, like these podcast discussions, and of course our men's group discussions before that, have always been fun to me, because it's like I get to finally be, like a little bit more free with what I say.
Yeah.
And say the kinds of things that I'm thinking about like all the time, especially with my own faith. And it's also in a safe place too. So I think that was part of the thing for me, was to really like, how do I enjoy what I have? Like, you've heard that old epithet or that old proverb about it's not having what you want, it's wanting what you have. So really good.
Preach.
I think that was in
Preach, brother.
yeah.
A
That
coloring book.
That was that was on a yogurt
Barnes and
can, I
Noble.
think.
It's really good, Jim. I think I saw that on an episode of Sesame Street.
Yeah. But seriously though, that is true.
100%.
You know, if you already have, like how I was saying, like, look, we're already saved, we're already enjoying God, like why aren't we just enjoying it?
Yeah.
You know, as opposed to like thinking, well, I'm missing out on what the world's doing. Looks like they're having fun and I'm going to church and I'm not.
I think
It's kind
because
of like The Office, the Benihana Christmas. Is that Benihana where Angela has her own party and Pam and Karen have their own party, the separate
Yep.
party?
Yes, it is.
Yes,
And it was like,
Yeah.
Angela's like, oh, you have to be here. This is the right one.
the Nutcracker Christmas.
Right, yeah.
Walk in, everyone's sitting there completely dead silent.
Exactly. Yeah.
Can't have more than
And it's
one
like
brownie.
sometimes that
Yep.
feels like Christianity to me, where it's like, this is what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to drink this. You're supposed to eat this. This is therefore fun within that. So
Yeah.
this is what you're supposed to do.
And I
And
feel like
So
there's-
enjoy it. Sit down and
there's such
enjoy
a
it.
danger to that too, because like I feel like even when I was growing up, like there were so many times where like I was a good Christian kid and stuff like that, and I did not always feel a good Christian kid because why? Because I struggled to actually do any devotions. I struggled to pay attention during sermons and all this
Sure.
stuff, and even though like yes, I knew all the stuff in my head and stuff like that, I would feel guilt because I didn't do any devotions that day or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
And that's so wrong. Like it's
Right.
it points up to the opposite way where like what John Piper's saying, like you should be finding enjoyment in this. Like you should be finding happiness in God, not doing this out of requirement. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Right.
Right.
And I think that even goes, I think he talks about it in the marriage chapter
Yes, he does.
where he's talking and he's like, if your marriage, if you told your wife that, you know, like, yes, I love you, but the only reason you're saying that is out of duty or obligation. Like that's not going to be,
Yeah.
there's
Yeah,
no
exactly,
joy in that.
right.
And that's such an insulting thing to do.
Yeah.
Like you should love your wife because of who she is, but because of what she brings to your life, because of the enjoyment you find in her and you know, the life that you build together.
Get in the car. It's date night. Yeah, exactly. That's Josh whenever he has to do anything romantic at all.
But like, and that's what
Here's flowers, I guess.
Right. It's such a big to do. Like, just let's get this over with.
But
Did you read this book? Did you?
You made a comment a second ago about how it's often looked at like what you're missing out on
Yes.
in like in the rest of the world, like
Yeah,
the secular
the
world.
fun that you could be having.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that the biggest thing, at least for me, like in my personal life, is my walk of faith has always been lonely up until
Yeah.
the last few years.
Yeah.
And I would say this group of guys here the last couple of years has really like scratched that itch for me
Yeah.
to have friends and laugh and to goof around and not be
Literally.
sitting around getting drunk saying the F word every other word, but actually enjoying each other, making jokes about like some of the characters in the Bible and having like
Yeah.
a little bit more intellectual discussion. It has been so fulfilling for me and so
Sure.
enjoyable. And it's been something that the first 30 years of my life, frankly, I didn't have any of that.
Yeah.
And so I didn't want to be bored on a Saturday night. It wasn't like I really wanted to go out, let's go get blasted. Like, yeah, there's some days where you feel like that, right?
Sure.
And I did that way too often in my 20s. But I think a lot of that was because I didn't know anybody or I hadn't invested the time to get to know anybody.
Yeah.
And the Christians that I did know, I didn't feel like I had a lot in common with. And when I was with them, I didn't feel like I was having that much fun. It was sort of
Right,
like,
exactly. Yeah.
and these guys are different. They want to keep talking about like Game of Thrones and all
Right,
this other
exactly.
like
Gotta be
Yu-Gi-Oh cards, and they want to play Pokemon. I'm like, oh, I don't
Yeah,
want
you
to do
just-
any of
why
that.
you
love
describing
that
it?
Josh,
Yeah.
wants to read Marvel comedies or Marvel comics. Yeah, not even. I don't even know what they're called, dude. It's all a little. No, but
Basically the Stormies and the Joshes of the world.
Yeah.
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 and there's nothing wrong with
Yeah.
that, but I didn't have that interest. Like I had nothing in common with a lot of the people that I met to this point, and I just didn't find much joy in it.
Yeah. It's almost like the Flanders effect on Simpsons.
It really is.
You know,
Yeah.
like you see that, and that's
Yeah.
that's the typical Christian family or whatnot.
Yes,
and they're
right.
just like all the things they do. from the outsider's point of view, are not fun at all.
and super corny.
Exactly,
And, yeah,
like so lame.
so
They all enjoy it for some
Yeah.
reason.
my brother's one friend used to always call us the Flanders family.
Oh, really?
Yeah, which is kind of ironic because we weren't really like that, but
Exactly.
in a lot of ways we were exactly like that
Right.
too.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, yeah, and we watched that a lot when I was growing up, and they do. It's funny because Simpsons has they poke fun at Christianity quite a bit, especially church.
they poke fun at
Church-
everything, which I kind of like.
Yeah, no, I like it too because
Yeah.
there's lots of it that is true about the way that we exactly this type of thing. Like there's a scene I think where everybody's sort of itching to let go or itching to leave this church service, and he keeps like saying more verses.
Oh yeah.
And like everybody's like, oh, he's gonna stop, and then he says something like amen, and they're like, okay, now you say amen. They all run out. Like it's just funny because
Well, it's
I
like
think-
real life.
yeah, I think
Yeah.
we've all thought that in church before. You know, like at one time I saw my dad nodding off, in church, and I was just like, oh man, if I can't even keep it together, how am I going to keep
You want to know a funny story? On Easter, or not, the week after Easter, I was exhausted. Jesse and I were out super late the night before,
right?
and Sophie came to church, sat with the adults, and as soon as worship got done, I sat down and pretty much fell asleep immediately, and I could feel myself nodding off, and I woke up, and Sophie was like kind of giving me the elbow. She's like, "Dad, you slept through the whole thing. There's only 2 minutes left." And I was like, oh my gosh. I was super embarrassed. I turned and looked at the clock, and then I looked back at her, and she was just like laughing hysterically because it was only 11:42. So there was still 18 minutes of serving to go. And she's like, gotcha. And I was like, oh man, she really did get me. Because I was like out. Yeah, I was out hard enough, right? It could have been 30 minutes of sleep. Like, yeah, it turned out it was only 12, but it was way long.
Yeah,
By the time worship got over, but it was really funny though. I was like, oh
that's
man.
so good.
Also, I was super disappointed. I'm like, 18 more minutes. Come on. Do you think there's like a fear amongst Christians that when they have too much fun or they make jokes or they fall asleep in church that they're being
sinful.
irreverent?
Yes,
Yeah.
it's somehow it's wrong.
Well, I
It's
think there's
sinful
times
or-
I think it's kind of easy to like go over the line
yes,
and
for
become irreverent or be, maybe even blasphemous, like unintentionally.
I would agree.
And so I think that's almost like a big fear, right? It's like, okay, we don't want to accidentally, not take this seriously, so we'll just take it real seriously.
But it's also almost like this borderline hierarchy where it's the pastor should be the most Christ-like, and therefore they are the most stringent in following all these sets of rules.
Super
right?
disciplined.
Super disciplined.
Yeah.
So therefore, you are trying to meet up to their level,
right.
and if you aren't there, then they can call you out, and it's almost like a principal's office of following the rules. When in reality, like I think that's part of the whole downfall of obviously, like I think it shatters so many people's worlds when they hear of pastors who are not nearly the Christians that they
Absolutely.
think they are. Like obviously, we've all heard of the horrible things of people being molested and those sorts of things, and obviously that's
I don't think
way
that's what
wrong
you're
on a
referring to, though.
different realm.
Mhm.
But even like
Yeah, going to the bar.
yeah, or like
Yeah.
right, like to me, I remember hearing of pastors. I think Rob Bell again was one of the first ones where it's like, oh, he went and drank a beer or something like that, and it's like, oh, you can be like a quote unquote normal person
Right.
and still be a pastor. Like that makes you more relatable to me, in my opinion. And there's a stronger desire for me as opposed to simply somebody who follows the rule that I can't feel like I necessarily totally associate.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah. No fun whatsoever.
Well, there's kind of a hard, it's like a fine line, right? Because
It is totally.
doesn't Christ talk about don't cast your pearls amongst pigs?
Mm-hmm.
And so you're like, okay, I don't want to be down in the dumps with people. And yet he also eats dinner with sinners and tax collectors and prostitutes and invites them into his home. And, he didn't have a home, but in the parable, right?
Yeah.
Encourages you to do that.
He didn't
So-
have a home.
Well, I mean, I would say he was more
like an
nomadic.
itinerant preacher.
Nomadic.
Yeah.
I mean, he had a home, in the first 30 years, but
Do you think that's interesting? I guess I never really thought
he
of
was
that.
homeless,
Jesus is homeless.
Was he homeless?
unemployed, homeless bum,
Yeah,
Long-haired, huge
hippie.
totally.
Yeah.
Met so many homeless people just like that.
And just by reading this, like the gospel and stuff like that, I think that they would be homeless too. Every place that he went, he was staying with someone else too.
Yeah, right.
Like, it was always he's inviting himself into somebody's home or something like that. Or
That's
somebody's
interesting. I
inviting
never really
him
thought
into
about
somebody's
that.
home. So I think, I would probably agree with that he was.
I mean, he definitely had a home as a growing up.
Right.
You're saying once he started.
Yeah, once he started his ministry.
He started his ministry.
Let's say his first 30 years, he lived with his parents or whatever. Maybe he got his own place, a little 2-bedroom studio. No such
They
thing.
got at the river.
I don't think there's any such thing as a 2-bedroom studio, but I'm not an apartment guy.
He's got 2 beds and half beds in the room.
2 Murphy beds that just fold into each other.
So, I mean, what were some of the things that, I don't know, that you thought were sinful that were actually just fun?
One of the
Getting wasted. No, I think that actually was.
Crack cocaine.
one of the ones to me has always been dirty jokes.
Right.
And you guys know, like I really enjoy making
A
dirty
good
jokes,
Filthy joke.
filthy jokes, and sexually laced jokes. Right. I find it hilarious to me, and I've never felt like. I always felt like I couldn't say those at like Christian camp or something like that. And somebody, I think it was in high school, maybe, was like, that falls under adultery based upon you having dirty talk and language. And
Right.
to me, it's like, really? Like, I don't know. I don't really think so. I never felt that way. And I was like, this feels like too strict. This feels too much of abiding by the law. Where it's like, I can make a joke and I think it's hilarious and I crack up and it brings joy and happiness to my life. And
Yeah.
and my wife like thinks they're hilarious. Not all of them.
Right, yeah.
20% of them she thinks they're funny, right? So
Frankly,
yeah,
that
on a
seems
good day.
high.
10% of them.
Right, yeah.
One time she thought it was funny, and
That sounds like when I do puns.
exactly.
Out of every 10.
But I remember that one time,
yeah.
and
I just live off that one time.
and so it was like, oh, it was part of like our connection. So honestly, I felt like after we got married that like it almost was like a little bit more acceptable for me to make some of those jokes because, oh, now you're a married man and it's less sexual or something like that. But that's one that's always stuck out to me. Did you pull out a banana purposely when I'm talking about making sexual jokes?
He already bit the tip of it.
Just the tip.
Which is
Name your sexes.